ratio of red candies to orange. Now, Laura's going to turn that backwards, and you are going to think of as many ways as you can to describe the relationship between the orange candies to all the candies. So how can you describe the orange candies? You can write it down right here. I had to change it because we don't have the tile. We don't have our counters. And the PowerPoint's not working. So how are you going to write it all the different ways? Give you about 2 minutes. Are labels important when you're writing ratios? Are labels important in science? I know when I was a kid, my science teacher was really strict about me writing every label for everything. My math teacher is less strict. But in fact, it really helps to write and include the labels for everything. Okay, we're going to give you 30 more seconds to come up with another one or two. Okay, now in your table groups, why don't you guys share, take turns, just round robin, sharing all the different ways that you describe these relationships of part to whole.
Oh, wait, yeah. 2 Starbucks out of 5 of us.
Okay, nice job. I heard a lot of different ways that you guys were able to say that. And I heard you including the orange candies to the total. It's important to label what candies you're talking about. So now, with those same candies, I want to talk about part-to-part relationships. So if part to whole was the 3 red candies to the 5 candies, what do you think? Talk in your groups. What might I mean by a part-to-part ratio? Talk with your groups and see if you know what I mean by that. A part-to-part ratio. Remember, a ratio compares 2 things, part to part. To the next level, Janet. All right. Yes. You'll have to. Okay, so who thinks they can describe a part-to-part ratio with their candies? Who's willing to talk?
For every 2 orange is 3 red.
For every 2 orange, there are 3 red.
And then the
other way around. And so you're saying in a different way too, for every 3 red, there are 2 orange? Do those mean the same thing? Talk in your group for a minute. Do those mean the same thing?
Right, that's what I was saying. Like you're talking about. We're talking about. That's.
The same thing. If you go back to Candy, that word just orange to red. And she
I'm not sure what you're saying. You say there's
said
three
orange to red.
red, five orange,
It's got X with the same ratio of birds.
three of five, and then there's a bunch of.
But can I say 3 for every, can I say for every 2 orange, there are 3 red, for every 3 red, there are 2 orange? Does that describe the same relationship? So if you're thinking about paint, mixing paint, it doesn't matter if I talk about the red first or the orange first. But Sean, what were you saying, when would it not be? Yeah. So that's where the labels actually come in, or with what, what you're actually comparing. Kids have a hard time with that, because they want to think that it's 2 different things. So one group wrote 2 orange for every 3 red, we're going to tell them you did it wrong, if they did the 3 red for the 2 orange.
When lost again, ask me. I like that one.
If you wrote 2 words, you're saying out of 3. Right.
That's not what you're saying.
No.
So that is not described, since I said 2/3.
No, but
When
you write it as a fraction, it means something different than when I write it as a ratio, that's where I'm going with this. Okay, so part to part. Is there any other way we could write this besides for every 2 orange, there are 3 red? Is there another way we could write it? It's another way we could describe it. Can it go back to your part-whole relationship? The way we wrote part-whole or any of those numbers?
40% to 60%.
Does that make sense? 40% to 60%? Well, that's up to 100%. Could you say just 2 orange colon to 3 red? Would that work? Are there any other ways to say it? So those are your part to part. And they're still talking about the same thing. Okay, then we have a third kind of ratio. And the third kind of ratio is an important ratio where we are taking 2 different things and comparing. So I'm going to ask you to substitute your 2 orange starburst with your 2 green dice. Can you come up with a way to describe the relationship to the dice and the starburst? And if you can write that down, everybody independently write that down. And then we're going to talk about an important math and science word. be described with a part to part because they are two different objects. So we are looking now at what we call an independent set. Independent. So let's think about that word, independent. We have a holiday coming up. What holiday do we have coming up? Independence Day. Does anybody know what Independence Day celebrates? Raise your hand, I'm calling you. What did you say, sir?
Celebrating our independence from.
And what does that mean? What does that mean, independence then? When we are celebrating our independence from King George of Britain, what does independence mean? By yourself. We are what?
Not under the rule anymore, we govern ourselves.
We govern ourselves. We stand alone. Say it again. Autonomous. We are autonomous. So these dice and these starbursts are independent of each other, are they not? They are not part of the same thing. They're two separate items. Each are independent, but in this relationship, there is a 3 starburst for every 2 dice, or there are 2 dice for every 3 starbursts. That's the other kind of ratio that's important for you to know, and that's called the independent set. The independent set, then, is one that we use quite frequently. So now I can move on to the PowerPoint and stick through.
Okay, so we talked about part-to-whole ratios, part-to-part ratios, and independent set ratios.
Independent set, very nice. How are the part-to-part ratios different than the independent set ratios?
They're the same things, candies.
Part-to-part, it's the same thing. Independent, it's separate. So we do not have Unifix cubes. I apologize for that. We do not bring those. So when we are talking about ratio language, we have talked about 1 to 2, 1 half red, 1 to 2, right? I would say though that for me, I always want to keep whatever word when I'm doing the 1 to 2. I like to keep the labels with it. So make sure that you always write your labels so that you can keep straight what you're comparing. If I'm comparing grams to centimeters, I'm going to want to make sure to label the grams and label the centimeters so I don't get confused. And those are the examples that we completed over here. You guys came up with all of them by yourself. Nice job. Okay, so sometimes ratios are a fraction, which is what we discovered, that you could write them as a fraction, right? The independent set, can we write the independent set? Is that a fraction when we write it as a fraction? So when we look at this independent set, why can't I write this as a fraction or consider it a fraction? And to be a fraction, what do we know about fractions? Part to whole. They have to be part of the whole. So here it's an independent set. And thank you, Laura. That's very nice pictures. All right. So then what I'm going to talk about next is a rate. And rate is comparing different types of items. So which one of our ratios is also a rate? If a rate compares 2 different items. So am I comparing 2 different things here? Because it's still a fraction, right? What about here? Am I comparing 2 different objects?
Yes.
So what is my rate?
2 guys,
2 dice to 3 candies, right? So 2 dice for every 3 candies, or 3 candies for every 2 dice. does. So then we come to the most important rate of all. Let's think of some real life rates that you use. What's a rate in your group? I want you to think about what are some words that signify rate. We use the word for every. What's another word that tells you it's a rate? For each? Write them down if you can think of it. Words that mean rate.
That's miles per hour.
So what is the tax rate? What is the tax rate? How do you say that? How do you do it? Your gross, your net, those are gross. Those are the same rate. Looking at.
No, net and gross are different. Gross is what you earn totally, and net is after you subtract stuff.
Like the unit, right?
The tax rate is percent. Yeah, percent per.
So if you're doing miles per hour, then you have units miles.
Yes.
Times.
Right.
Price per hour, so you have a price per other, right? But if you're talking about salaries, you do the tax rate of $100.
Right. Yeah. So it's not a unit rate, it's percent. For every dollar, yeah, it is. It's percent for every dollar. Oh, no, it's not. Talk about think about that. I know. Yeah. Okay, who has come up with some words that mean rate? What's the word that we use a lot? That means rate. Who came up with per? How many groups came up with the word per? So give me a real life example using per. Miles per hour.
Miles per gallon.
Miles per gallon, very important to me.
For $5 per dozen.
Per dozen.
Per hour.
$5 per dozen, right? I always think about the grocery store. How many things are done by the rate at the grocery store?
Per pound.
How many of you have ever had a fish tank? And you have to put the drops in. How do they tell you to put the drops in?
Miles per gallon.
Right, and mine was for 5 gallons. Mine was 2 drops for every 5 gallons. So that was hard for me to figure out. Why was that harder for me to figure out? 2 drops for every 5 gallons.
Need to know how many gallons goes in the tank in this place, how many 5 gallons actually.
Right, right. So then we talked about the rates, that 2 for 5. So then y'all have come up with the definition of the next one on your own, which is unit rate. And what does unit mean? Who knows what, in your group, talk about uni, U-N-I. What does uni mean? Unicycle, unicorn, universe. So uni means one. So a unit rate is a special rate, and it's a rate that's very important in science, it's very important in math. And based on the examples you guys gave me, it's very important in real life, isn't it, for things that we do all the time. So what are my 3 kinds of ratios? Part to independent set. And then what do you call the comparison of 2 different quantities that are related somehow? It is a ratio, but then a special, the independent set has a special name, not a fraction. It's called a rate. And what's a unit rate then?
Rate, one.
For 1, for every 1. So it's like broken down per 1 item. So that's what you're going to have to know about ratios in order to move on to the next part of this lesson. Do you have any questions about ratios?
Only independent sets have 3. Right.
You didn't hear the question, comment?
Any questions about?
I said, so only independent set are the ratio as rate.
With two different quantities qualify as a rate. The others, the part to part is a proportion, the part to whole is a proportion, but it's not a
Okay,
rate.
so independent set is a rate, and then the other one's a proportion.
Or fractions.
Okay, so proportion and fraction are synonymous? Okay.
They are, but a rate is also a proportion. So they fall under the umbrella of proportion.
Okay, you lost the red, we'll catch up.
Yes. Any other questions? So you can